He was only 18 years old, standing at the fragile border between boyhood and adulthood, wearing a uniform that still felt too heavy on his shoulders. The weapon in his hands was colder than he expected, not just in temperature but in meaning. It was never supposed to define him, yet here he was, assigned to hold, something designed to end lives, before he had truly begun living his own. His name would not appear in history books, not carved in monuments or spoken in classrooms, but on this day, through a single, unintentional moment, the world around him would tilt in a direction no one could undo. The morning air was tense, thick with the unspoken fear that hung over everyone stationed there. It wasn't the kind of fear that made people scream or run. It was quieter, heavier, the kind that sat in the chest and made every breath feel deliberate. Orders had been shouted earlier, boots had scraped against the ground, and engines had rumbled in the distance. But now there was an uneasy stillness. The young soldier stood among older men whose faces carried lines, carved by years of exhaustion, regret, and obedience. He tried to mirror their calm, but inside his heart betrayed him, pounding as if it knew something terrible was waiting just ahead. He had been trained, of course. They all had. Endless drills, repeated instructions, shouted corrections. He was told where to stand, how to hold his weapon, when to look forward and when not to look at all. But no amount of training could prepare an 18-year-old mind for the weight of real consequences. Training did not teach him how to quiet the voice inside that kept asking why he was there, or how a wrong move, even a small one, could ripple outward into something irreversible. The weapon slipped not because he was careless, but because his hands were tired, because his body was underfed, his sleep broken into shallow fragments, his nerves worn thin by days of anticipation. A single moment of imbalance, a shift in his footing, and gravity did the rest. Time seemed to stretch as the weapon fell, spinning slightly as it left his grasp. In that suspended second, the world held its breath. There was no dramatic music, no warning, no chance to correct what was already happening. The sound it made when it hit the ground was not loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the silence. Heads turned instantly. Eyes widened. Someone shouted his name, or maybe shouted a warning, but it all blurred together. The young soldier froze, his body locked between instinct and terror. He reached down reflexively, desperate to undo the mistake, but the damage had already begun to unfold in ways he could not yet see. What followed was not immediate chaos, but confusion. Confusion is often more dangerous than panic. One reaction triggered another. A misinterpreted movement. A defensive response taken too quickly. A safety protocol activated where it shouldn't have been. In tightly wound environments, where fear sits just beneath the surface, a single unexpected event can behave like a spark in dry grass. It does not need intent. It only needs proximity. Within moments, alarms were raised. Orders contradicted each other. Men moved where they were not supposed to move. Someone assumed the worst. Someone else reacted to that assumption. The chain reaction had begun, and it did not care that it started with an 18-year-old who never meant to hurt anyone. Systems built for war do not pause to ask why. They only respond to what they detect. The young soldier stood there, heart racing, watching authority figures rush past him as if he had become invisible. No one stopped to ask what had happened. There was no time for explanations. His mistake had already transformed into something larger than him, something that no single person could control anymore. He felt suddenly very small, swallowed by the machinery of decisions, protocols, and consequences that moved faster than human compassion ever could. As the situation escalated, the air filled with tension, so dense it felt physical. Somewhere nearby, people were being evacuated. Somewhere else, weapons were being readied. Each step taken in response to the last created a path that could no longer be retraced. The young soldier's thoughts spiraled. He replayed the moment again and again in his mind, imagining impossible outcomes where he caught the weapon in time, where the ground was steadier, where the morning unfolded like any other. But reality did not offer rewinds. He thought of home then, of a place that felt impossibly distant, a place where his biggest worries once involved school, family expectations, and the quiet uncertainty of growing up. He had crossed into a world where mistakes carried a different weight, where innocence was not a shield, and where consequences were measured not in apologies, but in lives altered forever. No one told him yet what would happen next. No one needed to. He could feel it in the way the atmosphere had changed, in the sharpness of every command, in the way people avoided his eyes. Something irreversible was unfolding, and even though he had not pulled a trigger or issued an order, he knew deep down that his life would never return to what it had been just hours earlier. The chain reaction continued to move outward, touching people who would never know his name, affecting decisions made far beyond his reach. And as the world around him accelerated toward outcomes no one truly wanted, the 18-year-old stood at the center of it all, trapped between guilt and disbelief, realizing too late that history does not always begin with intention. Sometimes it begins with a single human mistake. The first consequences did not announce themselves with explosions or headlines. They arrived quietly, carried by urgent footsteps, clipped voices, and decisions made under pressure by people who believed they were preventing something worse. The young soldier watched from the edges as authority took over the space, as procedures replaced patience, and as fear began to guide hands that were trained to respond without hesitation. What began as a dropped weapon was now a perceived threat, and perceived threats rarely receive the benefit of doubt. He was pulled aside, not roughly, but firmly, escorted away from the position he had been standing in just minutes before. No one asked how it happened. No one asked if he was all right. In moments like these, explanations are considered luxuries. The system moved faster than his voice ever could. He tried to speak once, then stopped, realizing no one was listening. His role in the unfolding situation had already been reduced to a variable in a much larger equation. Elsewhere, misunderstandings stacked upon misunderstandings. A signal was misread. A delayed response was interpreted as resistance. Someone assumed coordination where there was only coincidence. The chain reaction fed itself, each reaction justifying the next. In environments built around control and readiness, hesitation can look like hostility, and silence can sound like danger. The margin for error disappeared almost instantly. The 18-year-old felt the weight of responsibility settle into his chest, heavy and suffocating. He did not yet know the full extent of what was happening, but he could sense the scale of it growing beyond his grasp. He thought about how fragile the moment had been, how something as ordinary as gravity had tipped the balance. It terrified him to realize that no malice was required for catastrophe, only circumstances and fear aligned in the wrong way. As hours passed, the tension refused to fade. It evolved. What had begun as confusion hardened into caution, then into defensive posturing. Resources were redirected. Plans were altered. Lives were rerouted without their consent. The ripple effect moved outward, touching places far removed from the original incident. People who had never seen the young soldier, who would never hear his explanation, began making decisions based on the consequences of his mistake. He sat alone for a long time, replaying every second in his mind. The feel of the weapon in his hands, the slight slip, the sound it made when it struck the ground. Each replay made the moment feel sharper, more cruel. He wondered if he would be punished, if his future would end here, if anyone would ever believe that it was truly an accident. But beneath those fears was something deeper, something heavier. The realization that even if he were forgiven, the damage could not be undone. Outside, the world continued to shift. A precaution became a deployment. A deployment became a confrontation. No one involved believed they were doing something wrong. Each step felt justified in isolation. That is how chain reactions survive. They are built from reasonable decisions made without the full picture, each one adding momentum until stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. The young soldier thought about how adults had always told him that actions have consequences. He had understood the phrase in theory, but now he understood it in a way no classroom or lecture could ever teach. Consequences were not clean or contained. They spread. They tangled. They touched people who had nothing to do with the original action. And once released, they refused to return. As night approached, the atmosphere grew heavier. The tension that had once been confined to a single location now stretched across multiple layers of command. Communication channels buzzed constantly. Decisions were made in rooms far away by people who had never seen the weapon fall, never heard the sound it made, never felt the sickening drop in the stomach that followed. To them, it was data. To the 18-year-old, it was a moment that split his life into before and after. He wondered if history would ever trace the line back to him. Probably not. History prefers clear villains and intentional acts. It struggles with accidents, with human error, with moments that do not fit neatly into narratives of good and evil. Yet he knew, deep inside, that no matter how the story was told later, he would always know where it began. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the weapon falling again. He felt the cold rush of fear, the helplessness of watching something irreversible unfold. He realized that even if the world moved on, even if the situation resolved without the worst outcome, he would carry this moment with him forever. Some mistakes leave marks that time cannot erase, and as the chain reaction continued to develop beyond the horizon of his understanding, one truth became painfully clear. The most dangerous moments in history are not always born from hatred or ambition. Sometimes they are born from a single, unintended slip carried forward by systems that do not know how to stop once they have started. By the time dawn arrived, the situation had grown far beyond the moment that started it. What once felt like a localized incident had expanded into something layered, complex, and dangerously unstable. Reports had been written, rewritten, and interpreted through different lenses. Each retelling moved a little farther away from the truth of what had actually happened. The original accident was no longer the focus. What mattered now was the response and the responses to the response. The 18-year-old was barely aware of how much the world around him had shifted. He was kept in a quiet space, away from the noise and urgency, as if isolating him might contain the consequences. But consequences do not stay in rooms. They move through people, through decisions, through fear. He could feel it in the air, in the way voices sounded sharper when they passed by, in the way no one met his eyes for more than a second. Somewhere else, a line was crossed that could not be uncrossed. It was not dramatic at first. No sudden violence. No instant devastation. Just a decision made too quickly, based on incomplete information and heightened tension. The kind of decision that feels necessary in the moment and unforgivable in hindsight. Once made, it demanded justification, and justification demanded escalation. The chain reaction tightened like a knot. Each action created pressure for another action to follow. Standing still began to feel like weakness. Slowing down began to feel like danger. The systems in place were designed to respond to threats, not to uncertainty, and uncertainty now filled every gap. The human element, the accidental nature of the original moment, was lost beneath layers of protocol. The young soldier sensed that something irreversible was approaching. He did not know what form it would take, but he could feel it, like the moment before a storm breaks. His thoughts drifted to home, to the life he had stepped away from when he chose to serve. He wondered how a single second could outweigh 18 years of living, how one mistake could suddenly define him more than every choice he had made before it. As the situation intensified, lives intersected with the chain reaction without ever touching its source. People followed orders believing they were preventing chaos. Others complied out of fear of making things worse. No one involved felt like a villain. That was the most unsettling part. Every action felt justified to the person making it. That is how disasters quietly assemble themselves, not through cruelty, but through momentum. When the consequences finally struck, they did not arrive as one clean event. They came fragmented, scattered across time and space. A confrontation here, a loss there, confusion everywhere. News traveled faster than understanding ever could. By the time clarity began to surface, damage had already been done, and accountability had become blurred beyond recognition. The 18-year-old learned what had happened in pieces. No one sat him down and explained everything. He overheard fragments, read between lines, sensed the weight in the silence. With every new detail, his chest tightened. He felt responsible even for things he did not fully understand. Responsibility does not ask permission. It simply settles in, heavy and unyielding. He wanted to scream that it had been an accident, that he never meant for any of this to happen. But he knew those words would change nothing. Intent does not erase impact. Regret does not rewind time. The world does not pause for explanations when momentum has already taken over. As days passed, the initial urgency faded, replaced by reflection and quiet reckoning. The systems that had moved so quickly now slowed, examining themselves cautiously. Questions were asked, that should have been asked earlier. Doubts emerged where certainty once stood. But hindsight, however sharp, could not undo what had already unfolded. The young soldier felt older than his years. Something inside him had shifted permanently. He had seen how fragile stability truly was, how thin the line between order and chaos could be. He understood now that history is not only shaped by grand strategies or powerful leaders, but also by ordinary people in ordinary moments, making human mistakes. What haunted him most was not punishment or judgment. It was the knowledge that the chain reaction had taken on a life of its own, that even if his role was acknowledged as accidental, the outcomes would still exist. Names would be remembered, losses would be counted, and his mistake would remain woven invisibly into the fabric of it all. He realized then that the most painful lessons are rarely taught loudly. They settle quietly, lingering long after the noise fades. And as the world slowly moved forward, carrying scars it would later struggle to explain, the 18-year-old carried something else. The understanding that sometimes history turns not on intention, but on a single moment when gravity, fear, and circumstance align. Time did not stop after the chain reaction ended. It rarely does. Instead, it moved forward quietly, carrying the weight of what had happened into places no report or investigation could reach. The urgency faded, but the impact remained, settling into memories, into routines, and to the spaces where certainty once lived. What was once an incident became a lesson, though not everyone would learn the same one. The 18-year-old was eventually allowed to leave the isolated silence he had been kept in. Nothing felt the same. The environment looked unchanged, but he felt like a stranger inside it. Conversations sounded distant. Faces looked unfamiliar. He was no longer just a young person trying to do his duty. He had become a living reminder of how quickly control could slip away. There were reviews, assessments, and carefully worded conclusions. Language was chosen cautiously, shaped to acknowledge fault without fully assigning blame. The word accident appeared, but it carried little comfort. Accidents still have consequences, and consequences do not vanish just because intent was absent. The truth lived somewhere between responsibility and tragedy, and no single sentence could capture it. The young soldier was not publicly condemned, but neither was he untouched. He carried an invisible weight that no uniform could hide. Nights became longer. Sleep came in fragments. The moment replayed itself endlessly in his mind, altered each time by regret and imagination. He wondered how close he had come to stopping it, how different everything might have been if his grip had been steadier, his footing more secure, his awareness sharper by just a fraction. What troubled him most was not his own future, but the realization of how many lives had been affected by something so small. A slip, a second, a sound. He began to understand that history does not always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an ordinary mistake, and only reveals its scale after it is too late. As weeks turned into months, the story moved further away from him. It became simplified, summarized, and reshaped. Details were lost. Context faded. The chain reaction was remembered, but the human moment at its center slowly disappeared. People spoke about outcomes, not origins. Effects, not causes. The 18-year-old became a footnote rather than a face. Yet for him, nothing had ended. He carried forward a heightened awareness of fragility, of how systems built for order still depended on human hands and human judgment. He understood now that discipline and training reduce risk, but they do not erase it. That even in controlled environments, unpredictability waits patiently for the smallest opening. Years later, the memory would still surface without warning, not as panic, but as reflection. He would think about responsibility differently than most. He would weigh decisions carefully, knowing that even the smallest actions can echo far beyond their moment. He would never again assume that mistakes are isolated or that consequences are contained. The chain reaction eventually became part of a larger story, one examined by others who were searching for lessons rather than blame. Procedures were adjusted. Training was refined. Warnings were rewritten. These changes would prevent future incidents, but they came at a cost already paid by those who lived through the original moment. The 18-year-old did not see himself as a cautionary tale, but he accepted that others might. What mattered most to him was remembering the truth beneath the narrative, that it was never about recklessness or intent. It was about how human beings exist within systems far bigger than themselves, and how even one unintended moment can set those systems into motion. In the end, this was not a story about a weapon being dropped. It was a story about how fragile order can be, how quickly momentum can replace understanding, and how the weight of history sometimes rests on shoulders that were never meant to carry it. It was a reminder that behind every chain reaction is a human being, standing at the very beginning, wishing desperately that time could move backward just once.